you're here because you're interested in VR in whatever capacity. We're excited to have you. Frankly, VR needs more people. It needs people with a greater diversity of backgrounds. It needs people experimenting and bringing in new ideas. So I'm going to tell you about some of our experiments, and in return, hopefully down the road you can tell me about some of yours. Okay, so since Unity and Oculus don't really need any introduction, I'll give a quick introduction on myself and my studio. So I'm a game designer. I make games. I went into games back in the mid-90s, basically reading Snow Crash and going, at some point first person is going to become VR, and I want to make VR. And now 20 years later, I can make VR. Oops, a little too close. So, sorry, the genesis for my going, like, this is actually maybe the right time, was when I was down at idSoft, where I was working under a fine gentleman known John Carmack, and we're basically messing around with things, and he's going like, I think it's time for VR, and there was like a very distinct point where we're back and forth between big rage and little rage, as we called them, and where he's going like, this is going to become this. And that was around about 2011. And yeah, you will always find people that are smarter than you, learn from them. So some of the games that I worked on over the years, bunch of different things. The main point, this is not to brag, this is to make a point. These are lots of different types of games. If you're a good designer, if you're a good developer, don't make one thing over and over again. Don't get stuck with one franchise or one thing or one expression. Try different things. Try different genres of interaction. Try different genres of narrative. Go from being, hey, I want to work on tools, to hardware, to games, to non-games. Keep trying different things. Stretch yourself as a developer, because it's necessary and you'll be better for it. And because it's hard. Digital myths. The focus of what we're doing, really quickly to continue to ground us, is that we're rooted in AAA. We're a Bay Area studio. We're building, as we frame it, technology and content for social VR 2.0. We think that there's a sense of playing together that's really important, that goes beyond games, and we're making. And we think that iterating on content and technology together it makes that process easier, because we're used to that. So I won't go really heavily into social VR, but I wanted to just kind of throw this up. If you're interested in social VR, there are lots of conferences that are starting to talk about this. I'll be doing a talk at the Augmented World Expo and at Virtual Reality Toronto, where in both cases I'll be diving deep into social VR and some of our explorations and sort of how we think it's being made and how it's going to be made going forward. But what I do want to sort of touch on is, this is not necessarily everything social, but this is a bunch of our approach. And to sort of look at it, keep in mind, we're game developers. We're focusing on the tactile, visceral interaction, the feel of it. And so hand and body interaction, things that are visceral, tactile, physical, motive, network, things, people. If we want VR to take off, if we want VR to go mainstream, it has to be digital, online, connected, and shared. You have to be in together. Putting on a headset cannot be an isolating event. It needs to be an event where you go in and you connect into other people, because the reality is that all of our devices at this point all connect online. Anything that does not, oops. Okay. And anything that does not connect online is essentially a step backwards, and your consumers are basically going to go, seriously? Because they want to be connected. Sorry, I'm thinking. Okay. So yeah, really quickly, again, the sense of the world, cooperative, replayable, emergent, systemic. People need to be able to go back in time and time again. It doesn't matter if it's a game or if it's a tool. They need to be able to start to learn the rules and the heuristics of it. They need to be able to start predicting it. And then there is this sense of VRX, and that's really what I'm going to go into here. Sure. That's okay. Okay. Hey, ooh, power. It's all of a sudden just working. That's cool. Power. VRX. There's a whole bunch of stuff there, but just start with the notion that it is immersive. Now, anything can be immersive. Reading a novel is immersive. Watching a movie is immersive. Being off and thinking, daydreaming can be immersive in your thoughts. But there's a sense of we're making something that is interactive, that is intuitive, that it is intimate. So yeah, this is a bit of our approach. We're going to keep sharing and sort of proselytizing and evangelizing the notion of social VR. So this is what I'm going to try to go through and lightning quick as I can. I've done some VRX talks before. I'm going to focus in really heavily on our experiments in movement, but I'm going to try to give you a really quick grounding. And also, frankly, feel free to take photos. Ask me afterwards. I'm more than happy to send you a PDF. We need to share information. None of it is sacrosanct. There is no canon, but it's figuring shit out, frankly, and trying to figure it out together. So yeah, please, if you connect to me on Facebook, connect to me on LinkedIn. There are fantastic forums on Facebook. We're trying to share information. We're trying to build this together. But yeah, just diving right in. I love this. Like, this is where we came from. This is this notion, a sword of Damocles coming down from the ceiling. That's what we're coming from. Trying to make something that basically looks like a pair of glasses, or is just sitting on top of your retinas. So defining VRX. In our notion of VRX, so first off, VRX is UI UX for VR. Common notions, but we need to bring it into a new space. We need to, just as we cannot take lessons from film and just apply them over wholesale, we cannot take lessons from games and apply them over wholesale. We have to learn a bunch of this stuff over. There's this focus on trying to create presence. We're trying to fool the eye into thinking that you are somewhere else, so that we can transport the player, the user, into another place. Transportation for VR specifically is really important. This should be going towards a sense of social presence, which is harder and which is this next step. And a whole bunch of us are just starting to talk about social VR and social presence and what the hell it is and how do we get there, because it seems to be a thing and we're still just figuring it out. But yeah, so what I would say is that just keep in mind that notion: augmented reality, layering, virtual reality transport. And then, of course, it's all on the spectrum. And you can say AVR and VAR and different types of MR. But the reality is that what you will figure out here, you can gradually apply across all of these. They're all blended together. So there's already been a fantastic breakdown of the numbers. What I would just say is know where you're starting. As a developer, always pick an initial native platform to start building on. You can absolutely spread across lots of this. There are fantastic tools to make that easier, but always start in one of these. Say, I'm going to build so that this experience feels good. A particular category and a particular piece of hardware, and then you can grow to others. But where you're going to start is going to say something about you and the choices that you make, and that's a good thing. You have to start somewhere. Now, I just want to say a couple of quick things here, which is that we have these basic categories here: mobile VR, console VR, PC VR. These are the ones at this time, actually, that there's already still a bit more. The reality is that these are growing. There's going to be expansion. There is a ton of things coming into the space across all of this. At some point, there's probably going to be a bloodbath, and then there's going to be a merger. It's sort of like, it's like basically, VHS and Betamax, except it's in basically 5 different verticals, and that's okay. It's the shit's getting figured out, and that's okay. It means that there's more experimentation now, and that's really good. Keep in mind that this is kind of going away. It's kind of sort of becoming this. The cardboard spec, it's kind of becoming web VR, which is then kind of spreading across all of these. And at the same time, this is a picture of the Intel Alloy. They're starting to become all-in-ones, and the likely reality at some point, 5 or 10 years down the road, is that all of these are probably at some point going into this. Now, there's going to be different brandings and different, we'll see how walled or non-walled the gardens are, but the reality is that we all want to get rid of the tethers. There's different computing power between these. There's different market sizes between these. There's different inputs. Know what you are choosing and why you're choosing it, but they all have different value, and there is no one wrong answer and one right answer. Right now, it's all just kind of picking stuff and trying it out and going, for this thing, I think this is the right one. So in terms of designing for VRX, draw from theater. If you're going to draw from an existing medium, don't draw from film. Draw from theater. Now, why do I say that? I say that because when you have a headset on, what you need to keep in mind when you go, okay, I'm walking around, first off, you are an audience. You are a live audience in a performance that is happening at that time. And the people who are designing need to think about your live performance and how that feels. They may also need to think of the audience, where there can be, I could be here, I've been at SF MoMA when they had, I've been at SF MoMA where they had an event and there was someone with a Rift on and was sort of, showing views of a virtual world, and at the same time, we are watching that person as he is watching that world. So there's nested realities, and that's entirely valid, and that stuff fits more neatly within a theater paradigm, right from the sense that you can be sitting there going, hey, you're watching me up on stage, and you can go, oh, what's going on up there? And I'm like, hey, I'm over here, and you're looking over there. And that's much more theater than you go film, there's a locked frame here, and I know exactly, I know at least that the primary information is within the frame. So yeah, please draw from theater because it feels a little bit more natural, and there are interesting things to try to resurrect in theater. One thing that I will leave with you guys. So when I was at BioWare, there's a wonderful point when Ken Ralston came up to lecture, and Ken Ralston is an old school RPG designer, and he also was a longtime Bethesda designer, and he led a whole lot of Bethesda's early stuff. And Ken very specifically said, the player's story are the anecdotes of the experience afterwards, not the narrative that you write in. He basically said, look, on a certain level, I'm a writer. I write RPGs, but I'm willing to let go. And in the interactive space, you have to let go. You put stuff up there, and it's not all that you found as you put this into the space. It's all that the user, the audience finds. And they might find some part of your story, and they might let go of it, and that's okay. But if you're going to think about doing narrative in VR, and you think about theater, but think about the importance of interaction, and don't assume that you can control the narrative of the user, because you can't. You have to let go. Draw from life. So for about 10 years now, I've made every designer under me read this book. The Design of Everyday Things. Think about affordances. Think about industrial design. Think about how the world around you is built, because the reality is that more and more VR is going to feel like real life in that it will have a lot of the complexity of 3D and of time and of interaction and physics that we expect from the real world. And the more that it does, the more that you have to design from life. But draw from sports. Think about the structure of how people interact with each other within the context of a whole variety of sports contexts, from poker to soccer to badminton. Think about how people interact with each other, and think about how they quickly learn rules to figure out how to play or how to watch other people. There are lots of really useful lessons there. So now, the next little bit, Oh, sorry. Actually, sorry. This is one more before kind of really heavily diving into the traversal, which where there are a whole lot of aspects of VRX, and there are too many to go over in such a short period of time. But one that's really key is think about these. This is a basic structure of what your users are going to be doing. They're either going to be seated, standing, or walking row scale, and what you need to do is assume that for what you're building, you will probably build for one as the native or primary, and depending on your experience and depending on your platform, you will probably need to build for at least one more as a secondary. You might get to the point where, like us, you're going like, we pretty much need to support everything. Realize that means you're going to be giving a lot of engineers a lot of work, and decide that whether you want to do that. If you have one person, pick wisely and just always pick one. But yeah, over the next bunch of slides, I'm going to dive into stuff that will be potentially hard to even photo. So feel free to ask me about it afterwards. But I won't try to break these down. I'll just say, these have distinct differences in terms of what the setup is. Maybe at some point down the road, it will all blur together. But right now, the hardware limitations kind of require this. So why traversal? Because you need to give your players a journey. Now, I'm not saying in everything, but in a lot of experiences, we're just starting to get beyond the, hey, I did an arcade thing or I did a demo and it's in one room and that's great. And then you're like, well, I can kind of see over there. Can I go over there? And, and if you do too many of those those small experiences are fantastic when you're starting out and going like, we need to have something very tight. We need to be focused. But then you start to get to the point of where your users are going to go like, well, I kind of want to look over there, and then I want to go over there. And VR should not be constraining. When possible, build to the sense that people want to poke the world. They want to interact with it. They run around everywhere. And that gives us a lot of really interesting problems to try to figure out. And frankly, we are just figuring them out. And this is a recurring theme in our talks, that we don't have any perfect solutions. And we're basically going, well, there's a little of this, and there's a little of this, and take your pick. Because there is no perfect solution. And that's actually a good thing, because it means that down the road, 5 years from now, we'll be like, oh, well, of course it's this other thing that, someone came up with randomly, and then 5 different groups iterated on, and then boom, it's perfect. But mobile was that same way, and it's good that we don't know it now, or that we're not trying to even say it's absolutely this. But yeah, build, if you can, build to that holodeck, build to that sense of creating, whether it's an adventure, or it's a simulation, or it's a training. People want more than just, I'm locked in place. It's cool at first, and they're like, oh, and then they start to want to kind of venture. So, choice. There is no one size fits all. There just isn't. Physiologically, we are not at a point where we can present one solution for traversal that can allow everyone to go through the space. You have to understand multiple postures and understand where you're limiting your audience. You have to understand motion sensitivity and understand it. Motion sensitivity and really simulator sickness, VR discomfort is a whole big thing. It's part hardware, it's part software. It's occasionally, support, for random things in APIs. Like you can literally make someone sick by having too much aliasing waiver as in their peripheral vision. You can make people sick by having objects that intersect through their body and their physical space. There are tons of ways of making people sick. A lot of them come down to us, all of us. And we'll get better at them. But we're learning that process. I won't try to address that because that's literally another lecture. But we'll just assume that you can get people sick, and all of you will, and don't feel bad about it. I was very thankful that I had folks at a bunch of places, including Sony R&D, who proceeded to get sick over and over until we got better. And when we got better, they got better. So I know that there's a bunch of text here. part of me likes to be very specific and categorize things and structure things. That's part of how I design. And I will try to, I won't really get into every little bit here, but just assume that we have experimented with a bunch of this. So this one I'm extrapolating on because we have not specifically done the location base. That's a little out of, you'll always find something that's a little bit beyond you. This requires a big space. But we've talked about how we could do this, and we've talked to some folks that we might do it with, and it's kind of cool. But the location-based is folks like Zero Latency and The Void. That's assuming that you get multiple people into one location. That's kind of like laser tag. It does mean that you go like, this is the bounds of the space, and if we want to go beyond the bounds of the space, we need to reset the space, and now everybody ready? Jump, we're in a new space. But it does mean that you can literally run across a space, and that's pretty damn cool. But yeah, it has a very particular strength and constraint, and that's really about things like theme parks, location-based warehouses. There will be absolutely more folks doing this because it even goes beyond arcades in where you go like, I want to go and try out that thing that I absolutely cannot do at home because I'm probably not going to convert my apartment into a warehouse where I can run 50 feet in one direction. But then people will go like, hey, let's have 10 of us go and try this. The best thing about this is that it is the least motion sensitive because you don't even necessarily have to have another option where you still kind of do with room scale. So it's very cool, but it has its own limitations and it has a very particular use case. Room scale. So the thing to keep in mind with room scale, which is basically walking around a constrained space where you go like, like we had this set up earlier where you go like, okay, about 1, 2, 3, 4, and then, you've got like a tripod and a lighthouse here, and you've got one here, and you've got someone who's like walking around that space, and then they're like, okay, and now I kind of need to recenter myself. And so there's, at least right now, it's cool, but it's also kind of artificial. It feels very good to be like, I can pick up this thing. I can take a step forward. Being able to take about 2 steps in any direction is really nice. It makes object interaction much easier. It makes fine navigation of, simple, please keep the 2D menus simple. It makes that easier when you can do this sort of stuff. It also can be really good, frankly, for interacting with another player, where you go like, hey, here, let me give you something, and I can step forward. So yeah, it's very cool in that space. It's something that's being used both by consumers. So one thing to keep in mind with arcade installations, there are a ton of Vives over in China. China is pushing very hard on arcade. Asia is as a whole. There will be likely a wider, that was an initial early deal of more than 10,000 units. That will diversify. There will be a greater number of devices, a greater type of devices. But that sense of having room scale and PC-based room scale, which is still a novelty and which is expensive, introducing it to people like the location-based, it's a really good way to get people in. And the notion that you can transition back and forth between these two is pretty cool. One very specific thing I will say is that, and this is personal opinion, anything less than 10 by 10 is not room scale. If you can stand in the center of the space and you can do about that, but you can't really do more than that, that's standing. Like, standing is good, but we have to make a distinction. And if you cannot pace around the space, because you can't go like, oh, in my perfect situation, the reality is your users will always break it. So understand the distinction between standing and room scale, where in standing, you're basically going like, I'm kind of doing this, and then in room scale, you're like, no, I'm doing this. And that's a really important distinction. So free roam. So free roam kind of goes back to starting with Quake and those days of moving around a 3D space. Free roam, push in a direction to move. Our studio, over the last couple of years, has at different points done, I think, 4 different variations on free roam. You can tune it almost continually. You can rework the controls steadily, but the important thing with free roam is that if your users do not get sick, they will often find it, and if they are comfortable with the paradigm of separating real movement and abstract movement, and that they can deal with, I'm here and I'm not moving and my body's moving forward, and that doesn't wig them out, the reality is that it will often be the most freeing form of interaction to them. Some people will absolutely hate it, and this is the easiest way to make people sick. But you will have other people who will go, I don't want to do this other form because it breaks immersion. And this, because it's kind of coming from first person, can be very immersive for the people who can handle it. So if you do it, realize that there are absolutely different ways to mitigate some of those circumstances. So for example, you can combine free roam with roam scale so that people can, take that last 10%, they can be free roam and then step. And just the fact that they can back and forth between taking a couple steps and free roaming, if they get comfortable with that, can mitigate motion sensitivity. Tune it. And what I would say there is that you want to be able to play around with acceleration and deceleration. You don't want to have a big, what we in controller terms would call a dead zone. You don't want to have a really fast stop and start. You want to allow people to really control that. You can try narrowing the FOV. Some people love that, other people hate that. You can use grounding elements like body representation or cockpits. Cockpits that are really heavy in front of you will absolutely help that a ton. Body representation will help that, but not quite as much. Variations on this, flying, driving, rocket packs are all basically free roam, in addition to actually moving a body forward. Spline-based movement. So spline-based movement, this was actually the first thing that we started out with, saying, okay, we're going to use this for our demos because it will help to constrain the movement for users who are just getting into VR and still getting used to it, and we'll take them on a ride. So we found that A, you could still make people sick with it. B, some people would be frustrated that they're like, I'm going along here and I'm being pulled and I feel like I have something pulling me forward and I want to go over there and damn it, and I'm gone. But the reality is that it's really good for some things. It's really good for mobile VR. It's really good for all-in-one devices where you may not have good controller input. You may not be able to, you may not have something that is positionally tracked to hit an exact point. So it's, if your focus is gaze tracking and being able to tap a couple buttons, spline is still really good. Within that, you can either have linear splines or you can have branching splines with nodes. You can have, fine stop start motion, or you can just put somebody on a ride like a roller coaster. You've got a bunch of choice. But what I will say is that, and this is actually one of the most important things. So these two here is that with spline, think about a user in a car. A user in a car. So a passenger in a car is being driven by somebody else. If the passenger in the car can look at the road forward, if they have things that they can focus on where they can predict where they're going, they can still get sick, but they might get a little less motion sick because they can see their path. So we at one point specifically put in a visual representation of the spline because we're trying to cue people into hey, you're going over there. So it felt less abstract and less just like someone was grabbing the middle of their chest and pulling them forward. The other thing is constant velocity, where in free roam you actually want lots of acceleration and deceleration. In a spline, you really want constant velocity, and the folks at Sony R&D hammered on us about this, particularly in terms of like you're going forward, and then you're using a spline tool, and then there's a Bezier curve, and you're going around that curve, and all of a sudden the speed feels different. And they're like, no, actually set up a different adjusting speed, and then we did a bunch of that by hand, and then eventually we set up an auto move tool that looked at what spline segment we were on and made sure that it auto adjusted because we were doing so much work by hand. But yeah. The reality is that it's somewhere in this range of medium to high sensitivity, but for some devices it's really useful. And you can still slow the speed down. Like Land's End, the Monument Valley guys do a fantastic job of moving you slowly through a space to keep you in it. Fixed nodes or node jumping. So this was used by Bullet Train. It's been used by a handful of different games and demos here and there. But the core idea is that there are populated nodes around the space. And usually what you're doing is you're saying, I can see n number of nodes within proximity, and those are my choices, and I can then gaze track and select, and kind of like a Connect, you may have a little and now you're popping over to that node. Again, this is something that is very good for mobile VR. It's actually still reasonably good in some cases for console VR, depending on what the experience is. The big problem that we had with this, in fact, even more than Spline, it felt like you could explore the space more. And so then we were making a very object and interaction-rich space, because we just kind of kept doing that because it was fun and good. And then we had to go away from this where we said, like, okay, right, when we're ready for a mobile VR project that we're actually talking about now with some folks, that we may use this. Because it's an interaction that fits that UI UX need, but in the PC space it felt constraining because again you're like, I want to like get there and then I can teleport over, and it works well for something like Bullet Train where you're like, oh, I'm just going to pop around the space and shoot a bunch of stuff, but as soon as we're like, I want to grab things and pick them up, you're like, do we have to have a node for everywhere? And we kind of did. So the good thing about this is that it is low sensitivity in contrast to the spline-based. But because we kind of said like we kind of need to have one everywhere, we then put one in to allow you to have one everywhere. And this is actually much better on the PC space and the PC console space, where it's a little hard to see here from our game, but you can basically go like, okay, in fact, like we actually initially had a raycast straight out from the hand, but then we found it was better to have an arc so that we could arc over objects. But the key here is both that you basically have a sphere that says this is the volume that you're going to go to, and you have a 2D affirmation that says this is a valid surface also, so that you don't, because initially it would be like, and I'm teleporting up onto a bookcase. And no, you might want that, but for our cases, we're like, we want to kind of keep the player feeling like they're a regular human, so we want to surface test. And what that then means is that we need some amount of feedback of both where you're going and if you're surface testing or not. So yeah, and this is something that can be used with room scale. And in fact, like our current game, we actually use on the PC side, we use the blink. We use room scale, and we use free roam, and then we allow the player to basically smorgasbord pick which of those among those that they like. One other actual thing that I'll mention here, this was a really good idea that was brought up by Sony R&D, where they basically said for these teleport modes, think about potentially adding a physical blink. Make sure that there's always a transition. At least initially there wasn't, and some people don't do transitions. If you do not do a visual transition when you do a spatial transition, that's another way to make people sick. So you can figure out what kind of transition, but the reality is that you're doing something that is transporting the player. You need to give them a cue, even though they have the control and they're saying, do it now. They may effectively need okay, I'm almost ready. And so how it was initially described as like, almost have an eyelid come down and go up. Think about giving it a little bit of time. And then, the reality is that down the road, we'll probably have it be like a slider, similar to motion sensitivity, or like how much blink do you need? But yeah, that's basically where we are, where we're like, I think we kind of need this, and then down the road we'll figure out how much of this stuff becomes canon. So Rush. So I'm going to use Rush to talk actually back to a couple of the other ones, because this is one we're playing around with now. This is one that a few of us, and I know, for example, that the folks down at ID that are working on Doom stuff, or Doom VR, are playing around with some of this also in a couple other studios. But the rush is basically going, okay, I'm here, I'm selecting a point there, I'm rushing to that point, now I'm here. Now, the tricky thing about that is you're basically saying, I need to get over there, and I want to have a certain amount of persistence to that. And as opposed to that blink that just kind of jumps you over there. So the reason that you do this stuff is because of a bunch of these. Now, beyond immersion, and some people say, hey, it's completely immersive to blink, and some people say it's completely non-immersive to blink. But that's fine, that's opinion, but it's also opinion that is based on physiology, and people's physiology differs. This stuff doesn't. This stuff is good and hard stuff that a bunch of us in different spaces are all working on, which is that it's really nice to have players in persistent locations and to maintain persistence as they move around that space. As soon as you start popping people around spaces, you basically say the player is special and different, and you either have to start rewriting AI to handle the fact that they're like, and I'm, wait, are you over there? No, you're over there. Now you're over there. Like, the AI can basically just be like, I don't really know what to do. Can you stop moving so I can walk towards you? You can go like, hey, I'm carrying an object, and the object is in a physics simulation, and it's actually a good physics simulation, and then you teleport, and then the object goes flying out of your hands. In multiplayer, you can have situations where you're like, hey, I'm playing, and hey, let's do this, and then the player teleports over, and if they allow for a long teleport, you're like, wait, I'm trying to coordinate with you, where did you actually go? So beyond the fact that on the network side, it can be, frankly, a pain in the ass to deal with this, on the multiplayer coordination side, it can also. In the long term, we probably can't. If we're pushing things social, we kind of have to keep a certain amount of persistence. And so we need to find more examples like this of how we allow people to deal with different physiology, but to move around in a virtual space, to deal with the fact that there is an abstraction because they're not, like, I could be here, and in the virtual world, I'm zipping all over the place. Because there's so much that is not always one-to-one, we have to build abstractions, and we have to agree on those. And we have to sort of try to make them work enough that there can be a common design language for the experience for the user, and we find things where people can just go like, hey, I'll jump into this because I know it. Because people, frankly, play Call of Duty because of that. They're just like, it was like the last one, so I'll jump in and it feels good and it feels right, and then they'll go and play again. And that's okay. We're not there yet. But yeah, the good thing about this is that it is lower sensitivity. It's not perfect. You can still make people somewhat motion sensitive or sick, but it's better. Conclusions. So first off, just go and try things out. Experiment, break things. Assume that, if you can put yourself in the mentality of a 5-year-old, there's some fantastic studies of problem solving that put execs and 5-year-olds and random adults and teenagers into the same space and give them very simply structured things to figure out. And generally speaking, the 4 or 5-year-olds win. And the reason that they win is because they're quite happy to fail early and often. And so what you have to keep in mind is as you're going into VR and AR, there will be times where you will go, so I've been in games for, and now VR for 20 years combined. I will make assumptions that you might not make, and that's good. You might not make them because you might not be thinking about it from a game perspective, or because you're not thinking about it from a, hey, this is how we do things in software, or whatever else. Good new perspectives and new ways to get to those eureka moments are fantastic, because the reality is that we need to knock the blocks over as many times as we can to sort of figure this stuff out together, because there are no solutions but that we know of yet that are perfect. But in that, just make sure that you remember that right now, as you're doing this, don't fall in love with your solutions. Assume that they're wrong. Assume that you have a kernel of something really good in there and that it's about 90% wrong. and explain it to folks and be passionate about why it's good and be internally critical and going like, I must need to make it better, because you will iterate and you will find flaws in it as you explain it to other people. They will find things in it that you never thought of, both good and bad, and you will amend. And the process of designing for not just VR, but software and games and a whole lot of things in this interactive space is iteration. It's, it is iterating and perspirating and, ruminating, going like, there's got to be a way. And so keep that in mind. Don't sit down and go like, this is it. Now, we all just need to make this over the next 10 years. We go like, no, this is what I'm going to do now, and I'm getting ready to throw it out as I'm making it. So, yeah. So the last thing I'll just say is good hunting. Go off. All of you, please make things. Come back, share them. We all need to do this together. And we will not get better as an industry if we do not all come at this from new perspectives and learn from each other. So please, it's really scary sometimes to be like, hey, this is the stuff that we're working on. Keep some of your secret sauce internal, but share your explorations, share what you found to your friends, to colleagues at meetups, and then when you're ready out in public, and please tell me about it.